your time comes, don't postpone it. When others doubt and out, you don't condone it. Truth be told, yourself is your toughest opponent. When your moment comes, grab hold and own it. Never let go, stand tall and hold tight. Overcoming obstacles is the objective in life. Doubters all the night, and onto them you shine bright. Cause inside your head, on goes the light. Ignite, fight for intuition upon the stars in the night that glisten. To you they listen, to be you instead of the wishing. When your time comes, don't postpone it. When others doubt and out, you don't condone it. Truth be told, yourself is your toughest opponent. When your moment comes, grab hold and own it. When your time comes, don't postpone it. When others doubt and out, you don't condone it. Truth be told, yourself is your toughest opponent. When your moment comes, grab hold and own it. Never let go, stand tall and hold tight. Overcoming obstacles is the objective in life. Never let go, stand tall and hold tight. Overcoming obstacles is the objective in life. Doubters all the night, and onto them you shine bright.
You probably heard the phrase 40 acres and a mule. Here's what happened. In January 1865, a meeting in Savannah, Georgia, between Union military leader General William Tecumseh Sherman and a group of 20 black ministers resulted in a plan to redistribute confiscated and abandoned Confederate land from South Carolina to Florida. They called the land Sherman's Reserve. Newly freed slaves would be allocated 40 acres of land along with a mule. The phrase, which became well known even then, spread quickly. The plan had the potential to revolutionize race relations in the South and the economic future of the African American community.
The significance about formerly enslaved being given the land that they had actually worked was that they would be able to generate wealth as well as create wealth generationally.
By the summer of 1865, thousands of black families had settled on portions of the Sherman Reserve and were excited to plot their futures. But later that year, as part of his Reconstruction plan, actually intended to appease the former Confederacy, President Andrew Johnson abruptly canceled the order, giving the land back to its previous owners.
The United States had the opportunity to make it possible for the formerly enslaved people to be economically independent, and the country failed.
At the very same time that America refused to give the Negro any land, through an act of Congress, our government was giving away millions of acres of land in the West and the Midwest, which meant that it was willing to undergird its white peasants from Europe with an economic floor. But not only did they give the land, they built land-grant colleges with government money to teach them how to farm. Not only that, they provided county agents to further their expertise in farming. Not only that, they provided low interest rates in order that they could mechanize their farms. Not only that, today, many of these people are receiving millions of dollars in federal subsidies not to farm, and they are the very people telling the black man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps. And this is what we are faced with, and this is the reality. Now, when we come to Washington, in this campaign, we are coming to get our check.
The GI Bill provides returning soldiers and veterans a range of benefits, including mortgages to purchase homes, job training, loans to go to school, and this really was instrumental in creating the new American middle class.
When the GI Bill was being drafted and debated in Congress, Representative John Rankin of Mississippi played an enormous role as chairman of the House Committee on Veterans Affairs. An unabashed racist and an unapologetic defender of Jim Crow, Rankin persuaded his fellow lawmakers to make the implementation of the bill the responsibility of the individual states.
States and localities that had long histories of discriminating against African Americans were in some respects given carte blanche to close blacks out of things like college education and home ownership. Great wealth generating mechanisms in the American experience.
Federal programs and banks sank millions into the home construction industry. Their message to veterans: You can afford a new home. Buy a new home now. Tax dollars help make the single-family home a mass-produced consumer item. The American dream had a new name: suburbia.
It's the 1930s in the wake of the Great Depression. FDR is president. He wants to bring economic relief to millions of Americans through a collection of federal programs and projects called the New Deal. One part of that New Deal was the National Housing Act of 1934, which introduced ideas like the 30-year mortgage and low fixed interest rates. So now you have all these lower income people who can afford homes. But how do you make sure they don't default on their new mortgages? Enter the Homeowners Loan Corporation. The HOLC created residential security maps, and these maps, they're where the term redlining comes from. Again and again on these HOLC maps, one of the most consistent criteria for redline neighborhoods is the presence of Black and brown people. Let's be clear, studies show that people who lived in redlined areas were not necessarily more likely to default on their mortgages, but redlining made it difficult, if not impossible, to buy or refinance. So landlords abandon their properties, city services become unreliable, in most places crime increases, and property values drop. All of these conditions fester for 30 years as white people flee to the brand new suburbs popping up all over the country. Many of those suburbs institute rules called covenants that explicitly forbid selling homes to Black people, and all of this was perfectly legal.
The FHA underwriters warned that the presence of even one or two non-white families could undermine real estate values in the new suburbs. These government guidelines were widely adopted by private industry. Race had long played a role in local real estate practices. Starting in the 1930s, government officials institutionalized a national appraisal system where race was as much a factor in real estate assessment as the condition of the property. Using this scheme, federal investigators evaluated 239 cities across the country for financial risk.
So that those communities that were all white, suburban, and far away from minority areas, they received the highest rating, and that was the color green. Those communities that were all minority or in the process of changing, they got the lowest rating, and the color red. They were redlined. As a consequence, most of the mortgages went to suburbanizing America, and it suburbanized it racially.
As homes in white communities appreciated in value, the net worth of these white families grew. For most non-white families who stayed in urban neighborhoods, the housing market open to them in the 50s and 60s was largely a rental market. You don't gain equity by paying rent.
Dawn of the 20th century, African Americans in major cities lived scattered throughout the city. They weren't segregated particularly. It's only with the Great Migration of 6 to 7 million African Americans north and west escaping the South, the predominant response of the United States government and state and local governments to the Great Migration was to contain Black people in their own neighborhoods. And HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, was particularly a part of this role. But the precursors to HUD introduced and encouraged racially restrictive covenants, redlining of every major city where African Americans landed. The federal government was a sponsor of urban renewal, infamously called Negro removal by the great James Baldwin.
Urban renewal, which means moving the Negroes out. It means Negro removal. That is what it means. And the federal government is an accomplice to this fact.
We came to Levittown and we found the model house, and we walked in and we looked around, and of course in the eyes of a young man who was raised in the ghetto, so to speak. It was an interesting experience, an interesting lifestyle, seeing all the new modern conveniences. Very fascinating.
Eugene Burnett came home with almost 1 million other black GIs. They had fought for the country in segregated ranks. They returned hoping for equality and the American dream. For many, that dream was a new home for little money down and some of the easiest credit terms in history.
I went up to the salesman. We're interested in your home. We're interested in buying one. And what is the procedure? Is there an application to be filled out? So forth. So he looked at me, looked around, and he said to me, he says, listen, it's not me, but the owners of this development have not as yet decided to sell these homes to Negroes.
The GI Bill had the potential to put the American people on a level playing field, but black soldiers who came back, who were prepared and anxious to get higher education and buy homes, were not able to ascend into the middle class the same way that whites were.
Segregation started coming down after the passage of the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which actually only got passed in the wake of Dr. Martin Luther King's assassination. In 1980, 8 out of 10 black people would have had to move in order to be evenly integrated within metropolitan areas. Half of black people who live in metropolitan areas still live in neighborhoods of high segregation. So we've had modest improvement, but segregation persists. And economic segregation has spiked since 1970. The so-called American dream is only working for a relatively small slice of the population that can afford to buy their way into what I call gold standard neighborhoods that have the best of everything. And everybody else struggles, and the black poor struggle the most.
Where one's family lives in America is not just a matter of taste and preference. You have the issue of housing and wealth. The majority of Americans hold most of their wealth in the form of home equity. So that's their nest egg. That's how they can finance the education of their offspring. That's how they can sort of save up for retirement. It's their savings bank, right? They're living in their savings bank.
My family, like a lot of families, was in Detroit, struggling to buy a house. You had a dual housing market, one white, one black. A housing market with one with a lot of demand, another housing market with very little demand. My father lives in the house that I grew up in. The house today, 5-bedroom house, is worth about $20,000. That same house bought in the suburbs would be worth today about $320,000. So whites moving to the suburb were being subsidized in the accumulation of wealth, while blacks were being divested.
And these were public policy decisions in which, on one hand, people were given access to property, given title, and subsequently wealth, and on another hand, where people were not given access to property, did not generate wealth.
The other thing is banks were discriminating in terms of loans. We didn't have access to houses at the point when you could really get in and accumulate wealth.
So if we wonder why blacks aren't part of serious wealth holders in this society, why there's a 13, 14, 15, maybe even 20-to-1 gap in wealth holdings, that's a piece of it.
We really did have a moment in the history of the country where we could have closed the gap and made up for all the legacy and burden of slavery and Jim Crow and discrimination that had happened. Things like the GI Bill really had the potential to improve the quality of life and the future for African Americans.
Now it's 1968, and MLK is assassinated.
Good evening. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, 39
Apostle of nonviolence in the civil rights movement, has been shot
Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis.
In the aftermath, Congress passes the Fair Housing Act of 1968. It's a policy meant to encourage equal housing opportunities regardless of race or religion or national origin, and it offers protections for future homeowners and renters, but it does little to fix the damage already done. Over the next 50 years, the Fair Housing Act is rarely enforced.
That so-called urban renewal also included a federally sponsored interstate highway system, which was intentionally designed to mow through vibrant Black neighborhoods. Take Miami, for example. 2 highways, I-95 and I-395, bulldoze right through the predominantly Black and low-income Overtown neighborhood, previously called Colored Town during segregation.
The Department of Housing and Urban Development and the federal government writ large in the first 7 decades of the 20th century invested billions of dollars in racial segregation and concentrated poverty. Each time this country created a peculiar institution that subordinated Black people, slavery, Jim Crow, it created and dismantled it. They replaced it with another one. And the iconic Black ghetto, I don't use that as a pejorative, I use it as a descriptor, was a follow-on institution to slavery and Jim Crow.
You know what's so sad, man? You know what's wild? Martin Luther King stood for nonviolence. Now what's Martin Luther King? A street. And I don't give a fuck where you in America. If you're on Martin Luther King Boulevard, there's some violence going down.
So you can still see housing segregation and its effects in Baltimore and often along any MLK Boulevard in any U.S. city, like its effects on wealth. So home ownership is the major way Americans create wealth, right? Well, discrimination in housing is the major reason that Black families up and down the income scale have a tiny fraction of the family wealth that white families do, even white families with less education and lower incomes. For almost 30 years, 98% of FHA loans were handed out to white borrowers. Not only were Black neighborhoods redlined, and not only was the Fair Housing Act selectively enforced, if at all, but it is still, today, much harder for a Black person to get a mortgage or home loan than it is for a white person.
Families are fearful of speaking up about a basic human right that should be afforded to everyone in the world, but definitely in the richest country in the world.
And housing segregation in schools. The primary way that Americans pay for public schools is by paying property taxes. People who live in more valuable homes have better funded local schools, better paid teachers, better school facilities, and more resources. Here's the feedback loop. The better the schools in a neighborhood, the more those homes in that neighborhood are worth. And the higher the property values of those homes, the more money there is for schools, and so on and so on. And housing segregation in health. Because of urban planning that benefited those richer, whiter neighborhoods, people of color are more likely to live near industrial plants that spew toxic fumes. They're more likely to live far away from grocery stores with fresh food, and in places where the water isn't drinkable. They're more likely to live in neighborhoods with crumbling infrastructure and in homes with toxic paint.
When you're living with rats, roaches, and things like that, that's deplorable. You cannot have that kind of stuff with children running around in a building that may be full of lead.
And not coincidentally, people of color have higher incidences of certain cancers, asthma, and heart disease. And housing segregation in policing. Housing segregation means we are having vastly different experiences with crime and vastly different experiences with policing. Because our neighborhoods are so segregated, sometimes racial profiling can be camouflaged as spatial profiling, where living in certain areas can make you more likely to be stopped by the police. And it means that people have a lot of unnecessary contact with the criminal justice system just because of where they live.
The problem in our city, the police and the citizens are fighting. They keep targeting my brothers and sisters who don't really have nothing.
And that heavy, aggressive kind of policing that you see in Black neighborhoods in particular makes people feel like they can't trust the police. And when people don't trust the police, crimes go unsolved, and people have to find other ways to keep themselves safe. But of course, it's not just Baltimore, because housing segregation and discrimination fundamentally shape the lives of people in nearly every major American city. It really is in everything.
Today, I'm directing the Department of Housing and Urban Affairs and Urban Development to redress historical racism in federal housing policies.
This executive order is just one of 4 signed by President Biden, designed to address racial equity in the United States. And while this progress is a step in the right direction, there's still a lot of harm to undo. So what happens now? Well, some advocates are hopeful.
Home applauds this executive order for really focusing on historical patterns of racial segregation and discrimination in housing,
while others remain cautiously optimistic. Here's Professor Cashin's suggestion.
I don't take credit for this, but I applaud it. There should be an equity analysis. The federal government spends so much money, it should track who's getting it by neighborhood, and it should pursue racial equity in the distribution of resources. There's been a lot of movement at the local level on this. For the example of Baltimore, they did an equity analysis and found that they were spending 4 times as much money in majority white neighborhoods as in majority black ones. I think we're in this moment where people are waking up, sad to say, because of the slow execution of George Floyd, to the realities of systemic racism. And I believe there is an ascending majority multiracial coalition that wants something better than a separate unequal nation that overinvests in some neighborhoods and disinvests and preys upon people in other neighborhoods. I'm hopeful, but you can never stop working for and organizing for the country you want. New generation's more radical and less tired than me. There's always another generation coming.
Now is my time to shine. When your time comes, don't postpone it. When others doubt and out, you don't condone it. Truth be told, yourself is your toughest opponent. When your moment comes, grab hold and own it. Never let go, stand tall and hold tight. Overcoming obstacles is the objective in life. Doubters all the night, and onto them you shine bright. Cause inside your head, on goes the light. Ignite. Play the intuition upon the stars in the night that glisten. To you they listen, to be you instead of the wishing. When your time comes, don't postpone it. When others doubt and out, you don't condone it. Truth be told, yourself is your toughest opponent. When you